Cuba is, not doing very well right now. That system is not.
I wonder, Mr. President, though, I want to ask you because from your Vice President, J.D. Vance.
The world woke up to shock and anger as explosions echoed far beyond Venezuela's borders, not just shaking a nation, but testing the limits of global power. In a move that stunned allies and rivals alike, Donald Trump ordered a strike that changed Venezuela's future overnight, and now the world is responding, one furious voice at a time. Reaction has been pouring in from across the globe after the United States carried out what the Trump administration described as a decisive and large-scale attack on Venezuela, a strike that quickly led to the removal of President Nicolás Maduro and sent a clear message far beyond Latin America. As the dust settled, world leaders began speaking out. Some with deep alarm, others with open condemnation, and a few with praise, exposing sharp divisions in how this dramatic action is being judged. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres stressed the importance of international law, warning that the escalation sets a dangerous precedent and risks pushing the world toward a future where force replaces diplomacy. He made it clear that unilateral military actions threaten global stability and weaken the very rules meant to protect nations from chaos. In South America, Colombia's President Gustavo Petro strongly condemned the strike, calling for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council and the Organization of American States, arguing that no country has the right to decide another nation's fate through bombs and missiles. Cuba's president, a longtime supporter of Maduro, denounced the attack as a criminal act and urged the international community to respond, framing it as an assault not just on Venezuela, but on the sovereignty of the entire region. Russia's foreign ministry echoed that message, insisting Venezuela must be guaranteed the right to determine its own destiny without outside intervention, and warning that such actions could open the door to wider conflict. European leaders also reacted with concern, as Germany's foreign ministry said it was closely monitoring the situation and remained in constant contact with its embassy in Caracas, clearly worried about the safety of civilians and diplomats on the ground. Meanwhile, Mexico's leadership took a firm stance rooted in constitutional principles, emphasizing that it condemns any form of foreign intervention regardless of who holds power, stressing that respect for international law and territorial integrity must come before politics. From Havana to Moscow to Berlin, the same fear kept surfacing again and again. If this can happen to Venezuela today, it could happen to another nation tomorrow. The debate grew even more intense as some leaders warned that external control over a country's natural or strategic resources represents a grave violation of sovereignty and a direct threat to regional security. Yet not all reactions were critical. Argentina's leader publicly praised Donald Trump, applauding what he described as a bold stand for freedom, while Trump himself took to social media, defending the operation and framing it as a necessary step against tyranny. As these opposing voices clash, one question hangs heavily in the air. Has the world just crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed? Or is this the beginning of a new and dangerous global order? As condemnation grew louder, the language used by world leaders became sharper, reflecting not just political disagreement, but deep fear over what this moment could mean for the future of global order. In Havana, Cuba's leadership described the attack as an act of state terrorism, calling it a criminal assault against what they referred to as a zone of peace and warning that such actions violate the very foundation of international law. The message was emotional and defiant, rejecting what they called outdated imperial doctrines and declaring that Latin America is no one's backyard or territory to be claimed. Cuban officials framed the strike as an attack on dignity, independence and solidarity, saying that harming Venezuela is an attack on all nations that value sovereignty. Across the region, similar warnings echoed. Leaders argued that today it is Venezuela, but tomorrow it could be any other country that dares to resist pressure from a more powerful state. Mexico reinforced this idea by stressing that its position goes beyond support for any individual leader, making it clear that principles, not personalities, guide its foreign policy. Mexican officials emphasized that intervention undermines international norms and creates a world where power decides right and wrong rather than law. In Europe, concern turned into quiet urgency. Diplomats spoke cautiously, but their words carried weight as they warned that escalating military actions without broad international agreement weakened trust between nations and increased the risk of retaliation. Behind closed doors, discussions intensified about energy security, migration waves, and the possibility of regional instability spreading far beyond Venezuela's borders. Russia took a firm and calculated stance, accusing Washington of violating Venezuela's right to self-determination and warning that interference of this scale sets a precedent that could be used anywhere, at any time. Russian officials stressed that when rules are ignored for political goals, the entire system meant to prevent global conflict begins to crack. Meanwhile, voices from international organisations raised alarm over civilian safety, humanitarian consequences, and the long-term impact on peace efforts worldwide. The core fear remained the same across continents. If military force becomes an acceptable shortcut to political change, no nation is truly safe. Supporters of the strike dismissed these warnings, arguing that decisive action was necessary and overdue, but critics pushed back, saying that history has shown again and again how such interventions often lead to prolonged instability rather than lasting peace. As statements continued to pour in, the world watched closely, sensing that this was no longer just about Venezuela or Maduro, but about whether international law still has real power in a world increasingly driven by force. As global reactions continue to unfold, attention turned to the deeper consequences of the strike and the dangerous questions it raised about power, control, and the future of international relations. Many leaders warned that the issue was no longer limited to the removal of Maduro, but to the message sent to every nation rich in natural or strategic resources. Several governments argued that the threat of unilateral external control over a country's oil, gas, and key assets represents a serious violation of territorial integrity, one that could destabilize entire regions. Latin American leaders in particular stressed that allowing such actions to go unanswered would normalize the idea that stronger nations can dictate terms through force. The fear was clear. If this precedent stands, it could reshape global politics in the most unpredictable ways. From diplomatic circles to security analysts, the same concerns surfaced repeatedly. What happens when international law is ignored in favour of military dominance? Officials at the United Nations quietly acknowledged that the credibility of global institutions was being tested as calls for emergency sessions and urgent debates grew louder. Some leaders questioned whether existing mechanisms were strong enough to restrain superpowers, while others warned that failure to act would signal weakness and invite future violations. At the same time, voices from the United Kingdom and other allied nations sought to distance themselves from the operation, emphasising that they were not involved and reaffirming their commitment to international law. These statements appeared carefully measured, aiming to avoid escalation while also protecting diplomatic relationships. On the ground, fears of instability spread quickly as experts predicted economic shocks, rising oil prices, and potential waves of displacement that could affect neighbouring countries. Critics of the strike argued that sudden regime change often creates power vacuums, opening the door to prolonged unrest rather than stability. Supporters countered by claiming that strong action sends a warning to authoritarian leaders everywhere, but opponents asked at what cost. As these arguments clashed on the world stage, one unsettling idea kept resurfacing. If such force can be justified once, it can be justified again. Many leaders openly asked why this action should be considered acceptable in Venezuela but unacceptable elsewhere in the future. The question was not rhetorical, it was a warning. In diplomatic halls and public statements alike, the tone shifted from shock to unease as the world began to realise that this moment could mark a turning point, one where the rules of engagement between nations are quietly rewritten under the pressure of power and fear.